Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another juicy video. I know I was on a rampage last month and was about to continue, but real life unfortunately intervened and sabotaged all those plans. But anyway, I had some free time today, and you know what that means, guys? It means it's time for another video. So, homosexuality in the 10 big books. That's our topic today. Most of you who watched my other videos would know by now that I have a certain formula when I analyze the Malazan series, right? I look at the subtlety with which Erikson has handled a certain topic. I try to contrast that with what I consider to be tokenism that's rampant in modern storytelling. I try to use specific examples from the books to highlight these arguments. So you can look at my Malazan videos on racism, feminism, fascism, moral relativism, blah, blah, blah. And you'll see that this is almost always my general argument that there's a certain authenticity and subtlety in Stephen Erikson's approach to these things. So I figured, you know what? I'm not aware of any in depth discussions that focus exclusively on sexuality and homosexuality in the 10 big books. So let's do that. I'll try to keep this a quick video with just my general thoughts as a reader because I'm not an expert on this. But let's try to go through this in an analytical way, right? Let's do a quick roll call of the characters whom we could put in that category. We have depictions or suggestions of gay stuff with a number of different characters, but this doesn't necessarily change their sexuality. So, for example, characters like Silara or even Felicin are described as having had lesbian sex at one point, but I don't think you could put either of them in the same category as someone like, let's say, Tevor. And that would be my first observation here, which is that contemporary tags like gay and lesbian are kind of redundant in the Malazan world because, because sexuality itself is just taken for granted in the Malazan world, as most of you know because you've read the 10 big books. At no point does anybody's uh, homosexuality, let's say, get treated as a big deal at all. In Erikson's world, it's just something that people don't consider to be an issue. In fact, for all we know, with the exception of Yedan Derek, who specifically says, I am not interested in women that way, except him, for all we know, every single person in the 10 big books could be bisexual or pansexual or whatever, right? Because it's not like they discuss their sexuality, and it's not like any of them even flinch at the idea of a homosexual couple in any way whenever they do see it. They just accept it as something which happens in the world. In fact, I think it's even stated that in some places like Mekros in the Malazan world, gay marriage is quite common and nobody treats this as controversial at all, right? So almost everybody, in fact, every single person in the Malazan world has more or less what I suppose we would consider to be a pretty progressive attitude on this. Another example of how these modern day tags are too simplistic to describe the sexuality of some of these characters is Scalet, who's the prince of this desert tribe. He likes to, for lack of a better phrase, take it up the ass from men, but he is reserving his sperm, his seed, for a woman whom he considers a queen who can bear his children. So he has a lot of sex with a lot of men, but he considers the ultimate act of sex to be procreation with a woman worthy of his seed, to the point of him not even allowing himself to ejaculate during sex with men. So the modern day label to place on him, I guess, would be bisexual, but it's a lot more complex than that. You could interpret him as someone who's predominantly into men, but he wants to have children with a worthy queen, or you could interpret him as someone who's predominantly straight because he's far more interested in finding his queen rather than in all these different men he's sleeping with. His sexual thought process is so much more than the modern day use of the word bisexual. And I suppose my overall point there is that describing someone as gay or whatever sexual in the 10 big books is itself tricky. And this is once again where Erickson differs from so many modern day authors who would just bludgeon us over the head with the supposed sexual diversity in their book, right? So many modern storytellers and publishers these days are like, oh, look at all the sexual representation in this book, and please pat us on the back for that. Or look at all the sexual diversity in this book, and therefore, if someone hates it, it has to be because they're homophobic, right? But the 10 big books, they don't really pull into any of that cheap stuff. These books always, as I've said in many videos, have an understated quality to them in terms of the explorations of these issues. The Malazan series is very progressive in terms of racism, for example, if you, as the reader, have the depth to spot it. It is progressive in terms of feminism if you, as a reader, are willing to look deep enough to spot it. And similarly, there is an exploration of sexuality in these books if you, as a reader, want to look for it. There are some instances in the 10 big books, for example, where the bromance itself more or less becomes a romance. And this happens in other works of fiction as well. I'm sure many of you have seen the Charlton Heston version of Ben-Hur, which won all those Oscars. And William Wyler, the director of the movie, and Go Vidal, who helped write the film, both initially intended for that friendship between Ben-Hur and his friend to have homoerotic undertones. Of course, Charlton Heston denied this until his last day and said the movie had absolutely no homosexual undertones whatsoever, while Go Vidal insisted on it. He insisted that they made Charlton Heston act in it even without telling him that there was a gay subtext to all this. Go Vidal, by the way, is not only one of the greatest writers and intellectuals of the 20th century, he's also a great example of Ericksonian homosexuality, if we could even use that term. As in, Go Vidal was openly gay, but never flaunted it and never made that the basis of his identity or his aesthetic. Much like Yedan Derig, much like Tavo Paran, he wasn't someone whom you would identify as gay from his actions and body language and his basic aesthetic. And he certainly wasn't someone whose sexuality just blared out to the rest of the world. But at the same time, he never denied being gay. He lived for many decades with his male partner, and everyone knew that the two of them were a couple. So he was openly gay, but that wasn't really uh, the basis of how he communicated with the world, if that makes sense. And that's kind of like Tavor and Yed and Derek to me. Anyway, the point is that in Ben-Hur, it's doubtful whether either Charlton Heston or Stephen Boyd were aware that the writers had these undertones, but it can sometimes be there. And if we were to use a Malazan analogy, look at Marpo and Icarium. That is not bromance. Come on. That's just straight up romance. The Malazan books obviously have great friendships and great bromances. And I even have a separate video on Malazan friendships. But Marpo and Icarium, I mean, come on, guys. That's not just subtext. That's text. Even the journey that Marpo undertakes to save Icarium, and all he thinks of is saving his friend, and he's on this giant journey to reunite with his friend, with his soulmate. And we've seen this trope in fiction over and over again, particularly in fantasy fiction and mythology. I mean, how many stories can you name? I'm sure each of you watching this can name dozens, where one lover is on this epic odyssey to rescue the other who's in peril. In my own tradition in Hinduism, one of the most important stories is the Ramayana. And the crux of that story is the protagonist undertaking a hero's journey to rescue his wife. And this was written many thousands of years ago. And if we just pivot to the contemporary days, you could look at modern video games, movies, comic books. You would have seen this trope over and over again. And for some reason, the pathos and the emotions in that Mapo storyline, that reminded me a lot more of these types of stories where the hero undertakes this epic quest to rescue that precious love. And I know that it's not official, guys, but as far as the Ruth and Bat canon goes, Mapo and Icarium is not bromance at all. It's just straight up romance. There are lots of proper bromances and male duos in the series, but this is just a proper tragic love story, if you ask me. And the next time you read the Mapo and Icarium scenes, particularly the second half of the series where Mapo's on his quest, read it with this in mind, and you will know exactly what I mean. And I think most of you would agree with me once you read this with this seed in mind. What else? Another thing I find interesting about the way homosexuality is portrayed in the 10 big books is that we even see gods indulging in this. There's the errant who takes on male lovers, and there's, of course, the Erasal, whose human form as Tamber is Tavor's lover. And once again, it doesn't define their godhood. Just because the errant is sort of is homosexual, that doesn't mean he is now some sexual themed god. It just means that he is gay and that he's the god of chance or god of luck or whatever, right? His identity and status as a god has nothing to do with his sexual orientation. And the final thing I wanted to touch on in this quick video is the Cripple God. Not Kamen Sot, the character, I mean Book 10, the Cripple God. This book is almost like an analogy for coming out of the closet. I know many of you might think I'm joking, but hear me out here because I'm not. What are the two major plot lines of the Cripple God? One is the defense of the first shore, and the other is liberating Kaminsol. Who are the characters leading both these storylines? One is Yedan Derig, and the other is Tavo Paran, the two most sort of explicitly gay and lesbian characters in the entire series. I repeat, the two major storylines of Book 10, the final book of the series, are led by the two most recognizable homosexuals in the series. And that book, Book 10, has a lot of themes of liberation and escape and catharsis that you can almost compare to the experience of coming out of the closet. The first show storyline, for example, ends with the T standee who've sort of been living as refugees of their own identity, finally coming into their own and finally accepting who they are and preparing to face the future with this newfound acceptance of their identity. And the Kaminsot storyline ends with him being liberated after being oppressed and shackled and chained and tortured. And he can now finally come out and be made whole again and set free. And the character arcs of both Yedan and Trevor leading these two storylines have this major element of finally being open with their inner feelings as well. Because with both Yedan and Tavor, on top of being gay, they're also extremely stoic characters who are carrying this huge emotional burden within them. Yedan is trying to stay stoic for the sake of his sister, and Tavor is trying to stay stoic despite what happened to her sister. And Yedan finally gives in to that laughing sword, and he just rampages through the Tis Leosin until he dies as he starts becoming increasingly expressive. And that's his moment of release. And Tavor, of course, has that famous last line where she tells her brother that she lost Felicin. That again is such a moment of intense release. It's a moment of such catharsis in terms of someone who's been repressing this burden for so long and finally letting out the secret that she's been harboring, that's been eating away at her. In many ways, Tavos, sort of quote unquote, in the closet in terms of how she feels about Felicin's fate, right? She's completely in the closet for the majority of the series in terms of her own emotional reaction to what happened to Felicin. And that final moment in the end of the Cripple God is basically her coming out of the closet and expressing this deep burden hidden inside her. I mean, you could say that all this is nonsense and that book 10 is not allegorical in any way for coming out of the closet. You could say that I'm just grasping at random stuff here, and you may be right. But I find it to be too much of a coincidence that the two main storylines are both about these closeted and closed off people finding release from their repression, that is, in the form of the tea standee and the and Kamin sword in book 10. And on top of that, the two characters leading these storylines just conveniently happen to be the two most overtly homosexual characters in the series. As in, we're sort of given more than just hints that the two of them are gay. We're told in no uncertain terms that the two of them are homosexuals. And on top of that, the end of both their character arcs in the final book, as I said, also happens to be a release and catharsis from their need to hide who they are and how they truly feel on the inside. I find it hard to believe that all of this just lined up perfectly and all of this was just a coincidence. I think it was put in there intentionally. And as I said earlier, it's just there for the people who are willing to look deep enough for it. Just as how if you wanted to do a feminist analysis, it's all there. You just need to look deep into it. If you want to do a post colonial analysis, it's all there in these books. We just need to look close enough, but many of us don't, right? So, guys, that was my quick take on homosexuality in the 10 big books. I know I'm leaving out a lot of stuff like Picker and Blend or Tribun Knoll and Wally the Gaul and all that, but I don't want to ramble for too long. I just wanted to sort of express what I generally thought about the way that homosexuality is portrayed in the series and some of the themes that link up with that in the later books as well. So I hope you guys found that interesting. I hope it gave you guys something to think about. This is your High Fist. Take care, and I'll see you soon.